is he says, anyone who takes the Bible literally is insane. Like, just flat out insane. It's like, what people have to understand is that when the ancients wanted to teach people a lesson, they would tell a story. And History of Magic is his stories, or his stories, anyway. Essentially, it's a collection of stories where he's trying to give instruction and impart sort of what he's learned. There's one particularly poignant one where he's just talking about a choir master at Notre Dame who's suddenly overwhelmed by the idea that when there was only one person who Jesus refused to save, which was Judas, saying it would be better for me if this man hadn't lived. And that's when he kind of makes the connection that, well, if Judas hadn't turned Jesus in and had him crucified, not to his, although that's debatable. I was looking at this recently in the Gospels. Some Gospels say that he was happy that he died. Some Gospels say that he killed himself because he didn't expect the punishment to go on as far as it did. But yes, so he said basically like Judas is the only person who can't get out of hell. And then he becomes overwhelmed with emotion at this idea that in a way Judas is the martyr because he's the one who's condemned to eternal damnation, simply because he condemned Jesus, which is an interesting idea. And then he gets this vision that tells him that Judas will eventually be saved through human virtue and so on and so forth. But that's just an example of something that's like, it's in a book called History. He doesn't name the person who supposedly had this experience, and he doesn't really discuss the details of the experience, but he's introducing his readers to biblical ideas that are not obvious, and certainly probably not the ideas that most people will get. It's probably not a story that most people would hear in a Catholic church today, or at the time. This isn't the only example of this necessarily. Like a lot of the stuff in this really heavily informs Liber 418, and you can look at this two ways when Crowley says that he's the reincarnation of Levi. I mean, obviously he studied Levi, so obviously he would be influenced by his works. It's not too huge of a stretch to say that this could have just come out of him having read Levi very carefully and being highly invested in what he had to say. But it's also, the parallels go to the point that it seems a little bit more than just a written influence. So, as I said, I do tend to be critical of claims like this. However, in this case, I do think that it holds water. Another good example would be Levi's take on India, which he has this whole sort of history where the children of Cain migrate there and migrate with the tribes, and meld with the tribes of Abraham. He identifies Shiva with Ahriman from Zoroastrian mythology, which is kind of a leap, but again, like most of Levi's anthropological or religious studies work is sort of very armchair. I don't know if he ever even left France at this point. So he is speaking metaphorically, but also it's interesting that he introduces these ideas. It really wasn't popular in Levi's time to talk about the influence of Zoroastrian mythology on Christian dualism. And just to briefly break it down, in Zoroastrian mythology, there's a light god and a dark god, and they are at war with each other constantly, which is not technically in Christianity, is not technically in Judaism. God and Satan are not at war. That's not supposed to be part of the system, but it became, because of the Manichaeans, who were an early Christian sect and had a lot of influence on the way things developed, that idea sort of got stuck in there. And then it got picked up very strongly by Jonathan Edwards, who was sort of the first revivalist preacher. He wrote a tract called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and used to go around the States talking about this. He was the first fire and brimstone kind of guy, whereas that was not it's not a powerful image before. If you look at any references to hell in the Bible, they tend to talk about a state of being that a person is in while they're alive. And it refers more to this idea that I was talking about from Aquinas earlier, which is a distance from God, not necessarily like a place that you go when you die. There's a couple of passages in the Gospels that can be interpreted that way, but compared to all the times that hell is mentioned and hell is talked about, it's negligible. It's pretty negligible. It wasn't really till Jonathan Edwards came along that people started seriously embracing that idea and getting really into that idea of hell as sort of an eternal punishment, which is kind of important in terms of when we talk about the parody of a religion and the idea of a religion being used to control people. As Levi says, where did I put the quote? I can't find it. Okay. Basically what he says is that the laws of God are here to serve man. Man is not here to serve the laws of God. Like these things, which is a pretty profound statement from someone who was a nose hair away from becoming a priest. And this is kind of the thing when, this is what I wanted to say earlier. The metaphor, my favorite metaphor for religion in this context of parody is like a hammer. We can use a hammer for different things. A hammer is a tool. You can use a hammer to build a house. You can use a hammer also to cave someone's head in. Now, it's technically designed for building a house. That's real purpose. But it can just as easily be used to cave someone's head in. It serves both purposes. Although that's not really what it's for. And this is sort of where we come into Levi's ideas of virtue. At one point when he's talking about evocation, and this whole idea of controlled madness, he says there is nothing more to controlling demons than to do good and fear nothing. And that's, I find, to be a very interesting statement, and it's very true. And those two things, to do good and fear nothing, they're not easy. You can just toss off that phrase. It sounds real good, but in actuality, accomplishing that is incredibly difficult. Because first you have to understand what the idea of good is, and then fear is not something that is so lightly tossed away, especially if someone's doing practical magic. I mean, as someone who has been doing ceremonial evocation, I've been doing ceremonial evocation now since 1999, however many years that is, and I still have experiences of fear. I still have experiences of difficulty. I'm still you never get used to these things. It's just a matter of doing the yoga, having the concentration, and being able to use that technology without getting too wrapped up in it, and also being able to know how to respond to an experience of fear. And this is kind of where the idea of religious devotion kind of comes in and becomes a useful thing. It's not necessarily about faith per se, but it's about having something to hold on to. At one point, Levi says, man is a cripple and walking on two crutches, which are science and religion. And there's definitely a point to that, and something to be thought about with that. And it's very true. I mean, if we don't have these things, we fall, basically. Have we any questions now?
What are the dates for the revival preacher you mentioned, Edwards?
Oh, Jesus. I think he's in the 1700s. I wrote a deconstruction of his Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God. I can email it to you if you want.
Okay.
If I can find it.
I guess it's academic, but you were saying first, and I was wondering if because Milton and
I don't consider
Dante and
yeah, but I don't consider them to be like fire and brimstone preachers. They were, in a sense, writing religious satire,
religious fiction,
stuff like that.
right?
It's like if you want to go back, you get to Joaquin Fiore in the 1200s and stuff like that, and he's talking about kind of apocalyptic stuff, but it's not in the same. This was a guy who would go around to Jonathan Edwards would go around to kind of poor communities, get a bunch of people together who kind of didn't know anything, and try to just terrify them.
Okay.
He wasn't writing these tracts. Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God was his lecture. He didn't put it into a written form until much later.
Okay.
So it wasn't like a book that he did. He was literally just going around trying to scare people. If you, Crowley writes